Support comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. You might have missed it, but Washington just took a big step toward changing the equation when it comes to law enforcement, drugs, and addiction. KUOW's Amy Radil will tell us about it in a minute, but first, let's get you caught up. An Auburn man is under arrest for allegedly making a death threat against Mayor Durkin Tuesday. SPD says the man left a threatening voicemail for the mayor at her City Hall office. Detectives identified the caller, traced his location, then arrested the 43-year-old at his home later in the day. He's being investigated for felony telephone harassment. That was pretty fast. Washington's capital gains tax hasn't even been signed, and there's already a lawsuit to overturn it. Conservative advocacy group Freedom Foundation brought the suit on behalf of 7 individuals who say they own capital assets and could be subject to the tax. They want a court to void the tax on the grounds that it's a form of a graduated income tax, which would violate the state constitution. And add WSU to the list of colleges requiring a COVID vaccine to come to campus in the fall. Unless they've got a medical, religious, or personal exemption, students will need to show proof of vaccination by early August in order to live on campus. PLU, SPU, and Seattle U have also required vaccines for the upcoming year. So far, no requirement from the UW. For now, they're only strongly encouraging students to get a vaccine. Back in February, the Washington Supreme Court dropped a major ruling that briefly struck down the state's drug possession law. The ruling involved the 2016 case of a Spokane woman, Shannon Blake, who was found guilty of felony drug possession for a small bag of meth cops found in the coin pocket of her jeans. Blake was convicted and did jail time, but in her appeal, she argued she wasn't guilty. She didn't know the drugs were on her, she said, because the jeans were given to her by a friend. Because she didn't knowingly possess the drugs, the court ruled the statute violates the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. The justices struck down the felony drug possession law. Left alone, it meant drugs were effectively decriminalized here, but lawmakers took action to replace the high court's ruling. KUOW reporter Amy Radil is here to explain. She covers politics and government. Hey, Amy, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, Amy, so lawmakers took some action to replace the high court's ruling, but there is still a significant debate about how to move forward here.
And we saw that on full display, during the session. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, but it was interesting. It was not a straight bipartisan issue. It really came down to people who have had a family member where they've had experience with substance use disorder and just how hard that path can be for people. And it's given them different beliefs coming out of that on what the state should do. Some people feel really strongly that courts and law enforcement need leverage to get some people to seek help. No one's really pushing incarceration, but there is this idea that you do still need to have a criminal penalty on the books. And one of the people who talked about that from her experience was the mayor of the city of Redmond, Angela Burney.
As a mother of a daughter who struggled with substance abuse, we as a family were challenged to get her treatment, in part because there was no accountability or consequences for not completing treatment. It was not until the criminal justice system forced her into treatment that she was able to recover from addiction.
And other people said, we've never applied a criminal penalty evenly. There's always been racial disproportionality. And that's one reason to try getting rid of a criminal penalty since the court has given us this opportunity. One of the people who talked about that was Radil Johnson. He spoke on behalf of the Snohomish Ebony PAC, which is a good government group in Snohomish County.
This bill maintains the criminalization of drugs possession. We are strongly opposed to this bill as it is now because it does nothing to end or even mitigate the drug war that this country has waged on poor people and people of color for decades.
And just to be clear, he wasn't talking about the final version that just it has a time limit to it. This was when the Senate was still talking about making drug possession a gross misdemeanor permanently.
Okay, so what did lawmakers come up with after all of this compelling testimony?
Yes, ultimately, they made drug possession in our state a misdemeanor, and that's going to be the case when the governor signs it. It's an emergency piece of legislation, so it takes effect immediately, and that's going to expire in 2 years from now. So during those 2 years, we're going to have more discussion about what the state's final path really should be. I think law enforcement groups are pretty happy with where the legislature came down, because they said, the Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs and the Fraternal Order of Police say they're satisfied because making it a misdemeanor creates consistency statewide, and it gives everyone some time and structure to figure out the new approach. They didn't want it to be this chaotic, session ends and nothing happens. Meanwhile, other jurisdictions are passing their own laws. And law enforcement members are supportive of these diversion programs where they can refer someone to get treatment and recovery services, not necessarily book them into jail. So we also are going to see $90 million in state funding put toward expanding our treatment and recovery services, which is something that people who work with that population have really been asking for. So that's a reason that people on that side of the equation are also saying that they're cautiously optimistic.
How significant is it that Washington's Attorney General Bob Ferguson called this Washington's moment to overhaul our broken system and end what he called the failed war on drugs?
Yeah, he jumped in right in that crucial kind of last few days at the legislature where people just really weren't sure, are they going to finish the session without doing anything, where we still would have been kind of left with the impact of the state Supreme Court decision, but nothing to take its place. And again, certain localities saying, passing their own laws and creating a patchwork. So yeah, he said that he really supported decriminalization. Ultimately, we didn't go that far, but I think people are feeling like, well, let's use these 2 years for people to make the case for what they want to see. Now we have a little breathing room. Meanwhile, the approach that the state's taking is expanding the law enforcement assisted diversion program. People in Seattle might be familiar with that program, where police who see someone who has a substance use disorder, they can refer them to a caseworker who starts to say, okay, what do you need? Do we need to work on housing? Do you want to look at treatment? And that's happening also in the city of Burien. It's been unfolding there for the last 2 years. I talked to Sarah Brusig. She works for Discover Burien. That's their economic development organization. And her group kind of goes and checks in with local businesses. And she said there's definitely been concerns during the pandemic about an increase in people who are homeless and who have behavioral health disorders.
So a lot of what we hear is more personal safety concerns, and not so much that there's increased threat of security to the person, but that potentially there could be threat to their business. We've had windows broken in some new businesses that just opened. We've had people kind of just being on the step and you're not able to cross them to get into your own business. So those types of things have been an issue.
And again, that's the issue from the local business side, yeah.
And this resonates with a lot of businesses because, Amy, if there's one thing that is ensured in this path forward is that it's going to be bumpy, right? That there will be no fast solutions.
And Sarah said she feels like, there is progress being made there, and the lead folks are responsive and they give people updates about what's going on. But she said it is a slow process. It's not as definitive as, being able to just call the police and have, some kind of rapid action taken. It's more in fits and starts. And so people come down on that idea in all different ways.
Yeah, so we have this temporary solution right now, which really gives lawmakers an opportunity to talk a lot about what they would like to see over the next 2 years. So we are on a path that could lead to bigger changes in our approach.
Yeah. And, a lot of people are really interested in what the state of Oregon has embarked on, because voters there in November passed, it's called Measure 110. It got 58% of the vote, and they made it a civil offense. You can get a ticket now if you have personal use amounts of heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine. Even the fine can be forgiven if you go and get a health screening. So that's one approach. Some people were going to try to get that on the ballot in Washington. It's just kind of had some fits and starts. It hasn't gotten that far yet. They tried to promote that in the legislature. That didn't quite get off the ground. then the Supreme Court ruling happened, and suddenly it was kind of like yet another opportunity for us to say, do we want to do what Oregon's doing? So we're going to definitely take a more gradual approach if we end up there. But for now, we're going to at least see teams of what they're called recovery navigators that are going to be created all over the state to create, more 24-hour access to treatment, a focus on rural areas, a focus on outreach to people who are homeless. I even saw there's a provision for grants to do some public messaging to change people's attitudes about people with addiction and convey a message of hope. So that's going to definitely be part of this ongoing debate.
All right, KUOW's Amy Radil. Appreciate your reporting. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Seattle Now is produced by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, Clare McGrane, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.